Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Cecil. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Aging Research Institute. Welcome to our online Seminars in Aging program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Firstly, a little housekeeping regarding Zoom. At the conclusion of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can submit them throughout the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. So today is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and as such, we have a very special seminar, a showcase of some of our research and resources specifically focused on elder abuse. Today, we'll be hearing from Associate Professor Bianca Brynjath, Dr. Josephine Antoniadis, and Peter Feldman, as I believe Kate O'Halloran is unwell today. Bianca, Joe, and Peter are members of the Social Gerontology Division at the National Aging Research Institute. Their combined research interests include dementia, mental health, elder abuse, program evaluation, public health, and health literacy in culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So today they're going to be presenting 7 years of data from an elder abuse helpline in Victoria, the co-design and pilot of the Australian Elder Abuse Screening Instrument, developing films to highlight best practice responses for elder abuse in the context of dementia, and the primary prevention of family violence among older people living in Victoria. So welcome everybody, and over to our first speaker.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. I'll just get up my slides. And okay, there we are. So this is about 7 years of elder abuse data in Victoria. This presentation is a result of a collaborative project between Senior Rights Victoria and the National Aging Research Institute and was funded by State Trustees Foundation. This study analysed 7 years of data collected during the course of Senior Rights Victoria's advice calls. In addition to an advice call service, SRV also runs a helpline with information and referrals, specialist legal services, social work advocacy, community and professional education, and policy and systemic advocacy regarding elder abuse. Now, overall, Senior Rights Victoria advice call service is for older people who have contacted the helpline but need further advice. An advocate and lawyer schedule a phone call or meeting to give advice. And this lawyer social worker advice and casework model aims to inform the older person of their rights and support them in their decision making. So this study analysed data collected from 7 years of advice calls from July 2012 to June 2019. During this 7-year period, there were 3,221 advice calls made by older people eligible for and requesting further advice. Of this number, 26 were concerning non-abuse issues and 74% concerned at least one issue classified by staff as elder abuse. The data was analysed overall for the 7 years and then also separately for the first 2 years and the last 2 years to look at trends over time. There are some limitations to this data. First, obviously, it only captures information from people who've sought help from the SRV line. All the data has been provided by the older person and recorded by the lawyer and advocate. It does not analyse other calls to the helpline from concerned other people and professionals. It does not include abuse occurring in residential or community aged care where the perpetrator is a staff member, because this is a separate legal avenue to SRV's service. Furthermore, some types of abuse that require urgent response, including physical and sexual abuse and neglect, are more likely to be recorded by police, health and emergency and visiting services rather than a telephone helpline. And the study, so therefore, I should emphasise the study does not indicate prevalence of elder abuse in the community because the data is not drawn from a statistically representative sample of general population. Now, first up, the types of abuse recorded in calls. The most common type of abuse reported by clients across the 7 years was psychological abuse, 62.5%, followed closely by financial abuse, almost 62%. And then physical abuse at almost 16% and social abuse at 11%. There were some changes over time. Financial abuse began at just under 58% and increased to almost 64% over time. Physical abuse also increased from just under 15% to just under 17% over time, and social abuse from just under 8% to almost 12%. And again, I want to emphasise that neglect and sexual abuse are reported in very low numbers due to the nature of the service. There's nothing to do with the prevalence in the wider population. In terms of the characteristics of the clients, the older people, over the 7 years, women consistently accounted for 72% of advice call clients. Now, while women tend to live longer and comprise a larger proportion of the ageing population, it's still well out of proportion to the gender distribution of the Victorian older population, where 53% of the population aged 60 to 74 are women. We only hit 70% where for people aged 95 or over. So there may be some effect of men being less likely to call helplines and to recognise and report family violence. Nevertheless, there is clearly a gendered factor. In terms of age, the majority of older people requiring advice were aged over 70 years. Approximately 38% of advice call clients were in their 70s, followed by 29% in their 80s, and 1/4 of callers were younger in their 60s. 60% of clients had some form of disability, which is slightly higher than the prevalence of disability in the wider older population. 1% of clients identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, which is just above the Victorian population of 0.8%, but that figure of 0.8% is not adjusted for age. 78% of clients were from metropolitan Melbourne areas. So with ABS data showing that people over 50 comprise 40% of regional or rural populations in Victoria, this suggests an unmet service need for the regional and rural areas. In terms of socioeconomic status of clients, the callers, the majority of callers reported a low income, i.e. the age pension, which international prevalence studies show as a risk factor for elder abuse. Senior Rights Victoria focuses on providing services to those who can't afford to pay. So people of means who experience elder abuse, particularly financial, may seek independent private legal representation rather than coming through the SRV service. Having said that the majority of callers are on a low income, when we looked at the postcodes of residents and we used the ABS's CIFA postcode index to rank those postcodes by socioeconomic status, we found that the majority of callers are actually coming from the higher 5 socioeconomic status postcodes, and that peaks at the 9th point there. You can see on the 9th decile, that has the highest rate of calls. So this may be to do with greater awareness of Senior Rights Victoria in these postcode areas, in the wealthy postcode areas. But it's also maybe a situation of asset wealth rather than actual disposable income. And also we're looking at potentially higher vulnerability to financial abuse in more advantaged areas due to the greater asset wealth of the family home. What is not shown in the chart is country of birth. 48% of call clients were born overseas. The majority of those born overseas came from continental and Eastern Europe and Asia. In terms of individual countries of birth, about 7.5% were from the UK, and the next highest nations were Greece and Italy. And this obviously matches the post-war migration patterns to Australia. Stronger migration from Asia in recent years suggests that this trend may change over time. In terms of accommodation and housing, the majority of clients, that 60%, lived in their own home. with the next largest group being those who lived in the home of a family member. That's 12%. We're looking at the left-hand chart. The number who lived in residential care increased over the 7 years. So remember, these are callers who are experiencing abuse from a family member or friend, not from a worker. Looking at the right-hand column, we can see that 35% live alone, 26% live with a son or daughter, and 23% live with a partner. Now we're looking at characteristics of perpetrators. Out of the whole 7 years, 54% of perpetrators were men and 46% were women. So although most abuse is committed by men, the incidence of abuse by women is rising. The proportion of female perpetrators increased from just under 43% in the first 2 years to just over 47% in the final 2 years. So this marks elder abuse or intergenerational family violence as markedly different to the most common form of family violence, which is intimate partner violence, which is almost always perpetrated by men against women. Nevertheless, there is a gendered component when you look at the majority of victims are female. Now, looking at the gender of perpetrator and victim by abuse type, this chart needs a bit of explanation. It shows male perpetrators in the blue columns, or percentage of male perpetrators in the blue columns, and down the bottom along the horizontal axis is the gender of the victim by abuse type. So more than half of the perpetrators are male for each type of abuse, and this trend was stable over time. One exception is neglect abuse, where the majority of perpetrators were women during the last 2 years, 27 to 19. But the numbers of reported neglect and sexual abuse cases are small, so we can't really draw any conclusions about these types of abuse. Physical abuse shows some of the biggest differences between male and female perpetration. But the gap decreased in the most recent time period, where women had perpetrated 44% of abuse. So overall, women perpetrated more than 40% of abuse of all types, except for some smaller scenarios of physical abuse against the male victim and sexual abuse against male or female victims. The relationship with perpetrator shows some interesting trends when you do a deep dive. 91% of advice calls, the perpetrator was a family member of the older person, and 2/3 of the abuse was perpetrated by adult children, with sons responsible for 39% of abuse and daughters 28%. This was a stable trend over the 7-year period. Now, the smaller 9% of clients who experience intimate partner violence is not necessarily indicative of prevalence in the broader community. It may be that older women are accessing different services, such as women's family services, for intimate partner violence. And when you look at the living arrangement, the picture becomes also more revealing. 36% of older people who experienced abuse lived with the perpetrator. Amongst the SRV advice call clients, sons were responsible for a higher proportion of abuse than daughters, as previously stated, but this was irrespective of living arrangements, whether they lived with them or not. Now, when you take into account cohabitation, sons who lived with the older person reportedly committed more abuse than sons who did not live with the older person, whereas the opposite is true for daughters. Daughters who lived with the older person reportedly committed less abuse than daughters who did not live with the older person. Cohabitation increased the incidence of abuse by sons for psychological, financial, social, and neglect abuse. Among daughters, the effect of cohabitation is in the opposite direction. Cohabitation decreased the incidence of abuse by daughters for psychological, financial, physical, social, and neglect abuse. Now, the issue of perpetrators with complex needs has been an obvious and growing concern, noted by SRV staff in the casework, and it's often a driving reason for older people to make contact with the service as they seek assistance for their family member. In many cases, the risk factor is an adult child who has not left the family home because of difficulties associated with mental illness or one who has returned to live with their parent as mental illness, gambling, or substance abuse has made their independent living untenable. And the situation with the coronavirus pandemic and lockdowns is still to be played out in terms of SRV call rates, which they expect to see over the next year or two, the effects of the pandemic. 35% of perpetrators were reportedly experiencing drug, alcohol, or gambling issues. 31% of perpetrators were reportedly experiencing mental health issues. Over the 7-year period, there was a substantial increase of 17% in the proportion of perpetrators experiencing mental illness, and also an increase in those with gambling or substance abuse, an increase of 7% over the 7 years. Now, in terms of referrals out from SRV, during the advice call, clients may be referred to services that can help them address their needs. These include dispute settlement and mediation, magistrates court, a private lawyer, police, a community legal centre in their area, counselling, or for housing help. 25% of clients who called were referred on to SRV services for ongoing assistance, which means that the staff continue working with the client. Finally, the research or analysing the data also threw up some information gaps and need for further research, particularly into perpetrator behaviour and characteristics, particularly around trigger points for abuse and possible prevention measures, and obviously the effect of COVID-19 over time. And also we'd like to know more about client outcomes. So the SRV is adapting its database to capture more information about these things, and also including delivery to culturally and linguistically diverse communities and Indigenous communities and regional and areas. Okay, that's it. I shall stop here. That's it.
Great, thanks, Peter. My name is Bianca Bridgenath, and I'll be the next presenter and talk briefly around elder abuse screening and how we might consider ways of identifying this problem. I'm just going to share my slides and quickly whiz through this. I know some of you might have heard this before, but there we go. I hope it's on the full screen for you to see. So just talking about how we might identify elder abuse in the community in a range of settings. This particular project was funded by the State Trustees Australia Foundation and was undertaken in concert with St Vincent's Hospital as well. What we did is a few years ago, we developed the Australian Elder Abuse Screening Instrument, and we were really prompted to develop this screening instrument on account of a lack of consistency that was identified in screening for elder abuse, as well as perceived inadequacy of current tools on account of many of them being North American centric, using a lot of jargon, asking quite technical questions, and not really sort of soliciting, I guess, a rapport or in-depth engagement with older people themselves. We thus embarked on a co-design process that involved a World Cafe approach, engaging with stakeholders, etc. And it was a long drawn-out process. So 7 months and 10 drafts later, there's quite a process. We ended up with this particular tool, which some of you might have seen on our website. I would like to emphasize that this tool is not validated. So what we then did was embark on a pilot study to, I guess, identify whether it would actually work in practice. So was it feasible? Was it functional? Did it actually do what it was supposed to do? And did people use it the way that it was supposed to be used? So in order to do that, we did a before and after pilot, which ran from October 2018 to March 2019 in a busy inner city hospital in Melbourne, which applied in the social work department, as well as with some of the social work team that were embedded in emergency. But that also, the emergency team also included some physiotherapy and other allied health staff as well. What we were hoping for in testing this particular instrument was that we would see an increase in the notifications of elder abuse cases. We would see an improvement in the quality of the referral being made, And we would see an increase in participants' knowledge and confidence in screening for elder abuse. The process we embarked on was at baseline, that is prior to training, we retrieved administrative data from the site, which looked at their notifications around elder abuse in the previous 6 months and the nature of those notifications. We also then surveyed staff prior to training them in the new screening tool about what their knowledge and attitudes were around elder abuse and screening. After giving them the training, which was approximately 1 hour, we then surveyed them a week later on their changed knowledge and attitudes, and then repeated that process again at about 6 months, at which point we also looked again at whether notifications and elder abuse screening had changed. And we also interviewed about approximately 10 staff to understand their perceptions of using the tool and to know what worked and what didn't. The results were that there were 33 participants, 20 from the social work department and 11 from emergency. The vast majority were women. This was a fairly experienced cohort of people who'd been in their role for approximately 7.5 years or thereabouts. And they were about 38 years old on average. Now, remember our first hypothesis, which was that we thought there'd be an increase in the notifications around elder abuse using the tool. Ba-bow, bad news. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So there were 47 notifications in the 6 months leading up to the implementation of the tool, and then only 35 during the time the tool was actually being implemented. So that hypothesis did not hold up. We were also hoping for an improvement in the quality of the referrals. Pleasingly, that did come to pass. What we see here in this diagram is that the light blue slides, the light blue bars are pre-implementation of the tool, and the green and the dark blue are about post-implementation in terms of the referral. So across the board, what we're seeing, the good news is that there is an improvement in the quality of the referrals, and they're much more multidisciplinary. However, the reason why we put these green and blue bars in, the green bars reflect the people who didn't use the tool. And the dark blue bars reflect the people who did. So while we had the highest increase in the quality of referrals amongst those who did use the tool, we also saw a concomitant increase in people who didn't use it. So something was happening there. And then finally, when it comes to knowledge and confidence with regards to training, we did see an increase in participants' confidence, which is excellent because we know increased confidence in health workers will result in improvements in screening, or at least likelihood to screen. However, we found absolutely no change in knowledge, but this could have been because the base knowledge was already quite high. When we looked at the qualitative data based on the 10 interviews with participants to understand what happened, and this really goes to our kind of theories around fidelity. So was the tool used as intended? Well, the first thing we found was that participants they didn't feel the tool was natural enough. So they thought elder abuse was, as the social worker said, I'm used to operating in working with elder abuse and the natural art of conversation rather than having a tool in front of me. They also felt that because the tool wasn't natural, that they began to use it in ways that it really wasn't intended. So our tool was intended to be as a way to kind of, I guess, foster a rapport with the older person. It's meant to be undertaken in conjunction with them. But what was happening in this instance, as evidence from this quote, what's happened is they've not used it with the person, they've done their own assessment and then filled this out retrospectively. And then as this person says, I've got 2 people, 3 including myself, that have been reluctant to use it. So people sort of going around the back and completing the tool and not asking the questions necessarily in the order they're meant to be asked in. There was also a sense that the tool was not useful for experienced frontline workers. As this person said, I'm highly skilled and trained in screening and asking the appropriate questions. Potentially a nurse over the weekend when social work aren't available, this might be valid for them because they're not used to doing these types of assessments and asking these questions. Likewise, this other participant said, I do think this would help social workers who might be lacking in confidence around identifying and having these discussions, more junior social workers, new grads. So there was that sense as well. However, there were some staff who also said, look, it does increase transparency and having at least a standard measurement. that help someone become more thorough in their assessment because of their own self-perception of how experienced they are might be different from their supervisor's assessment of how experienced they are. So the tool was also perceived positively in some quarters. But overall, we've got really mixed results here. And I guess where we ended up with this was thinking, well, the tool is feasible in practice, but it's not fully doing what we want it to do. And that's partially because people aren't using it the way we think it should be used. So it's raised a number of questions for us. And I guess it's prompted us to think about things in different ways. And so we did feed these results back to the study participants and actually asked them, well, what do you think? And so they said to us, look, it did change practice, and it did promote more positive dialogue and conversation, and it did increase consideration and response to different types of vulnerabilities. However, there was a sense of, I guess, documentation fatigue that, as health workers and health providers have to fill an increasingly amount of paperwork, and that becomes very difficult. And so they were not very much in favor of universal screening, and they preferred case finding, which is, I guess, an investigation more along the lines of, I guess, a more thorough investigation of someone who you suspect as having experienced or experiencing abuse. Likewise, the staff also wanted the questions to be streamlined and more synthesized with current family violence directives, where you have a very straightforward question at the very front, which is, do you feel safe at home? And that's quite a common question that's asked across the board and can signal various different lines of inquiry, depending on the answer thereafter. So that's something for us to, I guess, take away and think about. In terms of the retrial, we're trying to find new sources and partners to team up with to retrial the tool, to, I guess, look at whether a screening versus a case finding approach is going to work, to also think about whether the method of administration ought to be changed. Is it better that perhaps older people just complete the tool themselves, or that maybe just a clinician completes it without engaging with the older person directly head on about the issue, or whether it's just observational? I guess these are things to be debated about in terms of a co-design process. We have had preliminary conversations with some ACAS services, as well as hospital services, as well as family mediation services, to see whether these tools could be, I guess, contextualized and adapted to those different settings. And in some ways, having these conversations alerts us to the importance of I guess the limits of a co-design approach, but also that you need careful consideration and training to integrate these new tools into practice. But nevertheless, that there is an absolute dire need to do so. And I suppose in some ways this presentation is a little bit negative, but we've decided to present it and include it here for two reasons. One is to, I guess, it's not always easy coming up with solutions for this very complex problem, but two, to also, this has been one of our pieces of research where we get a query at least once a week from a service wanting to use it. And it sort of breaks my heart a little bit to say, no, it's not validated, I wouldn't recommend it. But at the same time, to point out that there is an absolute desperate need in the sector, and people are really crying out for tools to help them undertake screening and identification of elder abuse in order to effectively respond. So I'm going to stop there because I know we've got a fair bit to get through, and we'll take questions at the end. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Joe, at the moment.
Hi, thanks. I will just share my screen. Just give me a second. So I hope you can all see my screen here. Oh, hang on. Sorry. I'll just try again. It didn't seem to work. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Great, excellent, thank you. All right. So in the same vein as Bianca just touched on in terms of finding tools and identifying ways to help frontline workers identifying elder abuse. I have the pleasure of presenting one of our more creative studies, balancing the older person's rights and carers' needs, elder abuse in the context of dementia. Now, this is also a project funded by state trustees and led by Bianca. So people with dementia are uniquely vulnerable to elder abuse, particularly from family members and carers, as also highlighted in Peter's presentation. However, when confronted with elder abuse, in many cases, service providers often struggle to balance, what the carer's needs and the older person's rights. So without clear and consistent messaging, training, and significant discrepancies can arise in provider responses to elder abuse in the context of dementia, which is particularly tricky. And this is a quote from one of the papers that actually sprung from the development of the Aussie tool that Bianca mentioned. Where's the line where the police needs to be brought in? And that was a service provider. So to address some of the training needs of frontline workers, this project is specifically aimed to co-produce with older people, carers, and providers 3 short films exemplifying best practice responses to cases of elder abuse in the context of dementia. So to do this, we developed 3 scenarios that we developed into short films. So the first scenario is where the carer financially abuses the person with dementia. The second scenario is where the person with dementia physically abuses their carer. And the third scenario is where there's unintended neglect by the carer of a person with advancing dementia. So the process of developing these films started where we wrote 3 scripts and we consulted with experts and key service providers to do so. We wrote the scripts up to the point of crisis. Then we invited consumers and key service providers to participate in our co-production workshops. To firstly workshop the scripts and secondly develop the step-by-step resolutions to the crisis. Once the scripts were completed, we engaged a professional film company that produced the films for us. The films were then member checked by the original workshop participants. And then we were meant to have a really exciting launch. However, thanks to COVID, this launch ended up being online. So that was in March last year. So right in the midst of COVID. So here are just some images from the professional filming, which we did in Sydney with a company called My Documentaries, and Bianca went up to observe. And I would like to just screen one of the films for you. So I'll just start it now. Please yell out if you can't hear.
Look, I know that you're not working at the moment, son, but it'll work out. If you can help me, you'll be able to get the carer's pension. And this house, it'll be all yours when I'm gone.
Yeah, okay.
Good on you, son. Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
It's very nice, is it?
Oh.
Ian, your father had a good day today. I'll see you next week. See you, Richard.
Thanks, mate.
Richard, I want you to sit down there on the chair and then I'll change the sheet. Please.
Sorry, mate. Didn't realise you were coming in today. Dad, you need to get changed. He's a stubborn old man. Never does anything for himself.
Your father seems to be a little more tired than usual. Does he eat anything today?
He has his food. I don't stand over him and make him eat.
Hi, Richard. How are you feeling today? There's few bugs in the corridor. Are you going on holiday? Or are you going somewhere? Richard. Richard. I'm really concerned. What should I do?
Sometimes families find themselves in difficult circumstances, and it's hard to know what's okay and what's not okay. Caring for someone with increasing needs due to dementia can be difficult and stressful, but there are services to assist. If you are working with someone you suspect may be neglected, even if unintentionally, the best line of action always begins with a conversation with your supervisor about what you've seen. Take notes of any concerns you have so you can be accurate. If you suspect someone is unable to take care of themselves and is at high risk or has been left alone, you should call police on 000. Sometimes people who are caring for older family members or friends may not realise there are services available or may be too ashamed to ask for assistance. In such cases, a family meeting is important to see if there are other siblings or family members to assist, and to let the carer know of options including counselling, respite care, and other carer support services to assist. Elder abuse is a difficult topic. Sometimes carers experience poor mental health, can burn out, and don't know how to assist a person with dementia. If we can assist people early, we can reduce the likelihood of neglect. If you need more information or would like to speak to someone about someone you care for, please call the Elder Abuse Hotline, 1800 Elder Help, 1800 353 374, and you will be directed to the relevant service in your state.
So that was one of our films on focused on neglect. As I mentioned, there are 3 films in total. So these are some of the snippets from some of the other films, as well as the one you just saw. They're all available on our website. So the films were launched in March in 2020. And I just had a quick squeeze at our YouTube, and we've had around 3,500 views across the 3 films, which is great. We've had great support from both ministers and government. Also, the uptake by the sector has been good. I always hear such nice feedback when I speak to people, and they've been promoted via social media. But of course, the more we can get it out there, the better. So if you would like, go and watch the films, like them, and tell other people about them. And they're really great resources. So the web address is down at the bottom there. So in conclusion, so what we've done here is you can really see that the co-production methods have helped develop 3 short films that have really good reach, uptake, and acceptability across the sector, and also healthcare services, and amongst older people and their carers. Now, what's really important here to note is that these films are a way of communicating a very sensitive topic in I suppose, an approachable and acceptable manner. And they provide means of a consistent messaging and a fair approach to dealing with elder abuse in the context of dementia. And so, as you saw in the film as well, workers sometimes struggle to balance the carer's needs and the older person's rights, and grappling of the ethics of coming to terms with grappling with ethics of elder abuse because of carer stress. And they're often unsure of how to deal with this particular ethical dilemma. So we hope that these films will inspire consistency and quality of responses across the sector, at least provide, short information to raise awareness, both in services but also in the wider community. And what's really important to understand is that, the better support and understanding of the potential stress experienced by family carers may lead to better services, and also help get the right support services to families, so families can stay together, and the older person with dementia doesn't have the experience of elder abuse, and we could relieve the stress experienced by families. So thank you very much. You'll have for listening, and you'll have some opportunity to ask questions after the last presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo. I'm the last presenter. I'll be presenting instead of Kate, who's not here today. So far, we've covered off, I guess, elder abuse in the context of the experience of it, its intersectionality with dementia, and identification. In the very last presentation, we wanted to focus a bit on primary prevention, and I guess giving you a bit of a taster or a snapshot of some work that we've been doing with respect to Victoria. And it's a 4-phased project that looks at the primary prevention of family violence. And just to remind everybody that the primary prevention is really about stopping the abuse from occurring in the first place by really addressing the drivers of abuse, in this case, ageism and gender inequality, other forms of discrimination. We're seeking to change attitudes and social conditions. So in using co-design methods, we wanted to look at what are the appropriate and feasible pilot interventions for primary prevention of elder abuse. And we piloted an intervention in using that process. So the first thing we did was a rapid systematic review of global primary prevention interventions, including the factors that determine effectiveness. We used those findings to then co-design workshops with key stakeholders, older people, family carers, to actually come up with an intervention that they would like to see implemented in Victoria. We then piloted that, and then of course, we're then going to be making some recommendations and identifying challenges to successful implementation, and what works and how it works. So I guess the rapid review findings are publicly available now. They're on the Respect Victoria website. The bottom line is what we found there is that there's very limited evidence on effective primary prevention. We could only find 12 studies internationally. And of those 12 studies, the ones that showed the greatest promise were ones that addressed ageism and took an intergenerational approach. And we found these sorts of studies in Canada, in Italy, and in Japan. Working with diverse age groups all the way from kindergarten children to adolescents and older people, of course. Effective techniques for implementation were ones that fostered social interaction across the generations, that had a bit of motivational interviewing, that were multi-component and tailored with boosters delivered by a multi-professional team. By this, we mean that it really sort of met the needs of the group and the individuals within the group. We follow them up regularly to make sure that they sort of sustain their engagement, and there are different people in the team to kind of undertake that process. And to maximize impact, the evidence tells us that partnerships across organizations, but also with older people and their carers, as well as the use of co-design and person-centered approaches, is most effective and impactful. When we undertook the co-design workshops, we used a World Cafe approach. The things that really mattered to people in terms of the drivers around elder abuse were tackling ageism, tackling gender inequality and gender stereotypes, intersecting forms of discrimination such as racism, homophobia, and transphobia, and ableism, as well as recognizing that capitalism might be a driver also of elder abuse insofar as the society only values an older person's contribution as long as it's a financial one and they're contributing to the economy. But once that stops, then somehow they're no longer a valued member of society. So those are some of the key issues that emerged from the co-design workshops. From the co-design workshops, participants' preference for an intervention was one that was face-to-face, group-based, 8 weeks long, that had a kind of, I guess, an active component to it, whether it was physical exercise, followed by a multicultural meal, that we undertake it at one metro and one rural site, and that it would have some sort of social media component, such as a film or a creative output that captured the process as the pilot unfolded. Now, regrettably, because of COVID, none of this could come to pass. Instead, what we had to do was redesign the intervention from face-to-face to and group-based to an individual one-on-one dyads, where they engaged for 6 weeks, either online or through phones, a phone-based program. And we had 35 participants, 16 older people and 19 younger ones. And they spoke for 6 weeks, 1 hour per week. We gave them a conversation guide to help them along the way if they wanted to use it. And we paid a lot of attention to the pairing and to make sure that we paired people who either had mutual interests or hobbies or a common identity or things like that. And then the research team made booster calls once a week to participants to see how they were going. And on the side, we've got a picture there of one of our participants during the sessions. We used both qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as some ethnographic methods to understand change over time as a result of the program. So quantitatively, we asked questions around the drivers of elder abuse using the Fabroni scale of ageism. We also inquired around risk factors such as depression and anxiety and loneliness. And what emerged in the co-design workshops was an importance on also people's capacity to blossom, to be connected. And so we asked questions around the flourishing scale and on the revised social connectedness scale. We interviewed a subset of participants, about 12 of them, for approximately 1 hour. And we also asked people to produce some sort of creative output reflecting their engagement in the pilot program. We didn't make that mandatory, that was optional, so some did and some didn't. And the photographs that I will now show you as we move through will reflect that, and I'll give a little bit of a backstory to them. Quantitatively, we didn't find any major changes or no significant results as such. But from our descriptive stats, what we did find was that ageism was lower in younger people, but loneliness was higher. So it was a social work cohort that student cohort that were largely comprised our younger sample. So they had very strong commitment to social justice, and we naturally assume that they had a lower kind of threshold for expressing ageist opinions. But we did find overall that there was a decrease in ageism between baseline and follow-up. More so for older people who we obviously, I guess, goes to that point of internalized ageism also being a factor that we need to think about down the track. Psychological distress decreased for both groups, slightly more for older people, but it wasn't a clinically significant result. Loneliness also declined for both groups, but peaked at the end of the program, especially for younger people. So I guess if you were to design an intergenerational program, it's important to keep in mind that when the program ends, people will feel a bit lonelier, but when you follow up, it's likely to return to the baseline scores. Social connectedness improved for younger people. Again, that's similar to the loneliness, a small rebound. And we saw very minor fluctuations in flourishing, again, mostly for younger people, but back to baseline by the follow-up, which was about a month after the program finished. Qualitatively, older people said that they did feel undervalued and that they lacked an opportunity to contribute, especially post-retirement, and that programs such as this really gave them an opportunity to offer some mentorship, experience, and share advice and insights with younger people. They also expressed a great appreciation for some of the struggles that younger people went through. At the same time, younger people They did have some stereotypical assumptions about older people in the sense that I think they expected the older participants to be quite conservative and they were surprised, I think, as the program unfolded that in fact older people had as progressive views as they did on topics such as gender and sexuality. And we particularly found this with some of the LGBTQIA plus pairs that we had. And so I've talked about some of the challenges that older people expressed with younger ones as well. The picture on the side there is one of our volunteer intergenerational dyads. They agreed to meet up after the program had ended, obviously also between lockdowns. And one of the things that they did was they actually got together for a lunch at the older person's house. And this is a picture of the table that was set for lunch. And golly, I wish I had a pair like that and I could get invited to a lovely lunch like that. But what we find that's really important when you talk about programs such as this is that pairing is crucial. The booster check-in calls are crucial. Having a conversation guide helps definitive start and end dates. That's really important, particularly for younger people, in order to kind of, I guess, help them plan and schedule what they've got going on, because quite often in our sample, they were a very busy group. The challenges is that we required everyone to have a police check, and that was very difficult, especially during lockdown. And because this was on account of COVID, we had to change this to an online intervention. We worry that we might have missed people who are, especially older people who are not digitally literate or less digitally literate and struggling, might have been struggling even more so than others. And of course, finally, program staff must be experienced with to deal with unexpected events. We did have 2 participants in our study where we suspected family violence was occurring. And we did have one of our participants pass away during the program, which was very sad and obviously very difficult for the younger person they had been paired with. So these are some of the things that do happen in these kinds of initiatives. So you kind of need to brace yourself for that and have a plan to deal with it. So we think intergenerational programs, as borne out by the evidence and our pilot, are a great way to undertake primary prevention of elder abuse. That if you can offer formalized mentoring programs or I guess link it to specific communities, such as the LGBTQI plus one, they're really important. That gender inequality and racism could be considered as well as ways to overcome some of that alongside ageism. I haven't gotten to that too much in this presentation on account of time, but certainly we found some differences there in a positive direction. And an implementation toolkit is very helpful if other agencies wish to replicate what we did and to realize effective outcomes. So I'll stop there and thank you all for your time and attention.
All right, well, we now have some time for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, you can put it in the chat now, or you can turn on your camera and microphone and we'll be able to call on you in turn. While we wait for people to put some questions together, I've got a couple on my list that I'd like to get answered. The first one, in your literature review of primary prevention studies, how often did you find studies that assessed ageism towards younger people as well as ageism towards older people?
Hardly any, but that might have been a consequence of our search strategy, which was really targeted towards addressing ageism directed towards older people. So we didn't find a lot of that, no.
Okay, good to know. And another question, I guess, for you, Bianca. In your graph, we noted that the number of referrals decreased after implementation of the Aussie. Do you have any theories as to why that was occurring?
No, the number of referrals increased, which was good. And the quality of the referrals increased, but the overall number of notifications went down.
Yes.
So that was a bit of a, look, part of it just could be the general sort of cut and thrust, I guess, of how, notifications over time. And not really hugely different because we had a difference of about 11 cases in the 6 months, or the previous 6 months it was 47, and then it went down to 35. But it could also be that the tool, maybe was not detecting enough cases, but it also wasn't being used as intended. So it sort of leaves us with a lot more questions than answers, which I know is not really helpful, but that's sort of where the dust settles at the moment.
Could I also add to that? It is also, I suppose, natural variation in just case numbers. So that was one of the things that, we discussed with our partner hospital, that, naturally sometimes, in some periods you have more notifications, and other periods you just don't have that many. And, people can't really explain that.
We have a question from Bryony now. She asks, building on this work, what do you see as the next research priorities be?
I think we need to do a lot more work exploring the intersection of elder abuse with phenomena such as cultural diversity, gender diversity, LGBT, sexual diversity, etc., and understand how it might manifest across different communities. That's one. I also think we absolutely need to be looking very closely at the intersection around elder abuse and residential aged care. I don't think that's really undercooked, in my opinion, and an area where we need to do a lot more work.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Oh, also, I'd like to add to that institutional abuse, which is, for example, I was interviewing an elder abuse advocacy worker who said during the lockdown last year, she was getting calls from retirement village residents, not residential care, these are retirement village residents, who the managers of the residences were basically barring them from exiting their village. Even though they had no legal right to do so, they were prevented from leaving their own accommodation to go see their GP, their pharmacist, go shopping. And this advocacy worker ended up, in one instance, actually getting the police to visit the village manager and explain the rights of citizens and residents to the manager. So there's a whole world of other types of abuse which can be looked at as well.
So Fernando asks a question here. Do we have recorded data or evidence of management teams expecting professional carers employed in home care and residential care to reduce their duty of care in mandatory reporting in order to reduce workload?
I don't think we've got data to substantiate that claim, but I'm happy to be corrected otherwise. But I do think we've got to get better at managing it. We tend to kind of dress it up as serious incident reporting, and we use sort of other terminology, but these are kinds of forms of abuse, and so they really have to be called out for what they are.
Actually, I've got a question, if that's okay, and it's on that note, Bianca. It's about the term, using the term elder abuse. So, like in the field of incontinence, people say, I'm not incontinent, I just leak a bit, because incontinence is such a stigmatizing condition to have. And clearly elder abuse is stigmatizing as well. To what extent does using the term elder abuse disenfranchise people from accessing help and services because they don't understand it as abuse so much as perhaps conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, we tend to use the term elder abuse in, I guess, service circles, research policy, academic circles, but when directly engaging with older people, you would almost never use the term elder abuse, nor even the term abuse or family violence. They're just such taboo topics. You'd almost have to use a different kind of language around, connectedness or financial planning or care planning, or much more neutral language.
Yeah, in the US, they use the term elder mistreatment, which is certainly a softer term, and possibly maybe we should look at adopting that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question. Gabrielle asks, what is NARI's blueprint for co-design?
Oh, we've got workshops on that. So maybe Jess, you're best placed perhaps to respond to Gabrielle, because we do run workshops on co-design and how to do it, and the approach we take, because we use a number of different strategies to realize our goals depending on our projects.
Yes, we do. I would say keep an eye out for the next co-design workshop that we'll be running, likely in early 2022. Well, in that case, everyone, sorry that we didn't get around to answering all of the questions on the list, but please join me in thanking our 3 speakers with your clap reactions. Great. Next week, we're going to be welcoming back Peter Feldman again for back-to-back presentations. Next week, he'll be discussing older people and homelessness. So please join us on Tuesday, the 22nd of June at midday. And thank you very much for attending our Seminars in Aging program.